This is Paul, and today we're talking about the Zika virus. We'd love for you to join our conversation. Call us on 415-663-8492 or give us a tweet at Let's Talk on KWMR. And I originally wanted to do this. Well, it was last week I figured out I was going to do it. It seemed to me like there was a rush to promote fear about the Zika virus. And when the CDC and the World Health Organization and others have not yet found a link. I mean, they're certainly seeing that there is infection with Zika virus in babies that are born with birth defects like microcephaly, with a small brain, kids being born with small brains. Meanwhile, they were spraying and treating the water pretty heavily with a larvicide, and up until about 2014, I believe, the old larvicide they were using in Brazil, this is in the poorest part of Brazil too, they were treating the water with a larvicide. And they discovered that the mosquitoes were becoming sort of immune to it. They were becoming hardened to it. So they changed the larvicide from one to the one that they're using now, pyriproxyfen. And nobody really knows. I haven't been able to find out if they're following standard sort of dosages or if they're just, who knows? Maybe they're dumping more in the water. This is in drinking water. They're dumping it in drinking water supplies. And who knows, maybe they're using more than they should. Maybe there's a combination of other things, poverty, bad diet, there are many things that cause microcephaly, including vaccinations, of course.
Yes.
Well, so Mary, you had something.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Mary.
The huge increase didn't occur until this larvicide was added to the water.
Yeah, well,
it didn't exist. And also, how do we explain the 25,000 cases of microcephaly here in the United States without Zika? So there's a group of Argentine and Brazilian doctors who have studied the effects of the incredible pesticide spraying, just incredible amounts of pesticide. And the link, I think, is there because of the more than 4,780 reported cases, only 404 infants have been confirmed of having microcephaly, and only 17 tested positive for the Zika virus. So there's no positive link there.
It doesn't really make sense. Additionally, at the same time, in the same area with the change and increase in the larvicides, it's also the exact same area where they did a release of genetically modified mosquitoes.
Yes.
And as Bernie was talking about earlier, viruses adapt and shift so quickly, and you bring in genetically modified mosquitoes. So, the Zika virus could have shifted in how it's working, so it's once again, there's so many things that are being done that are a threat. Is that a mosquito here in the room?
There's a mosquito in the room.
Oh.
Have you been to Brazil lately?
Yeah, Bernie, yeah.
Well, you guys are starting this topic at a fairly sophisticated level. And like last week, I didn't even know how to spell Zika. I still barely do.
It's a
I think it's
four-letter word.
Zika. But, I think most of our listeners may not really understand kind of what this Zika is about. It's sort of the latest form, is it, of a virus that we fear? In other words, we feared various other viruses before spread by various means.
Well, that was part of the reason I wanted to do the show, because we've seen these scares before over other things that, mostly turned out to be fairly non-existent. All these pandemics. Nobody's actually said pandemic this time, which I think is a step in the right direction. So Zika virus, it was first discovered in Uganda in the Zika forest. That's why it's called that.
Interesting.
Back in, I think it was 47. I've seen 57 and 47. And they first identified it then, Western doctors, while they were checking out the effects of other viruses like dengue and yellow fever, to which Zika is sort of, it's the same kind of virus.
And it affected monkeys and other
affected
animals?
monkeys, and then it got into humans, and they were seeing other different symptoms such as there's joint pain, fever, And never any birth defects showed up in those almost 70 years since it was first identified until now, which is when we're getting this big onslaught in the U.S. press anyway, who always jump on this thing and say, oh, Zika's causing this.
So is one of your theories that the current form of what is Zika virus now is something that has evolved from what started in the forests and was not as pervasive as a problem for humans?
Yeah, see, I want to point out to our listeners that, of course, we're not experts in this. And if there are any experts out there, please call in with any information.
Even if you're not an expert.
415-663-8492. Because I'm just going on what the research I've done in the past week or so. And I found a lot of information. But so Zika before, as I say, it's always been regarded as a fairly mild virus compared with dengue and yellow fever, which can kill you.
Yeah.
And there's another one that's related to it called chikungunya, which is also a really nasty one. So they've never really bothered. That's why there's no vaccine for Zika, even though it's been around. They've known about it for almost 70 years.
Aha, maybe that's why they're making such a big deal about it.
Well, so maybe so. Maybe they're, who knows? So it was Brazilian doctors, the Brazilian health ministry, who first said, "Oh, we think Zika is causing these birth defects," and so because they want to be overly cautious, CDC and World Health Organization started this big ramp up. Trying to figure out. So they're trying to figure out whether Zika has anything to do with birth defects or not.
Well,
and meanwhile, they're still fogging and spraying. They're spraying wholesale in these areas still, and they're still treating drinking water with larvicides, and fairly new larvicide to Brazil. Maybe they don't know how to use it. Who knows? And that spike in microcephaly, in small brain size in newborns, started right around that time, right around 2014. There was actually a spike in microcephaly in Brazil before the virus was detected, whether that's just because they weren't looking for it or whatever.
Well,
but Zika certainly spreads. I mean, it's a virulent virus. I guess that's where virus comes from. And it has spread from Africa across into Asia, across the Pacific, and it came to Brazil, they think, with a soccer team from the Cook Islands or somewhere when they came for the World Cup. So that's when it really began. That's when they started seeing it there.
Wait, there are other culprits, I think, involved, which is that infants born in Brazil, there's a lack of sanitation, there's widespread vitamin A and zinc deficiency, there's environmental pollution, toxic pesticides overload like you can hardly imagine, on top of course, the drinking water that has the larvicide, and the Tdap vaccination now mandated for all pregnant women.
And that happened in this time frame.
You
put giving a vaccine to a pregnant woman is like, what?
What? And you put that cocktail together, and, that's asking for all kinds of illness.
So, like, Zika is like a convenient way to put people in fear so that an agenda of pharmaceutical companies can be forwarded.
Yeah, remember when we were all going to die of Ebola not too long ago? And before that, the West Nile virus. And then this huge amount of money was released for, guess what? Research for vaccines.
But Ebola wasn't. I mean, I don't really understand this subject that well. But what I read in the news and what I understood was that they were dealing with it at the source in various African countries. Then they say that in effect they wiped it out again, and that Ebola has gone away. You think that's not really the full story?
I think that's only part of the story because if you look at the larvicide, I don't know if I mentioned this, but the larvicide that's being added to the water is a Japanese company owned by Monsanto, and we certainly can't rely on Monsanto for either telling the truth or necessarily having our best interest at heart.
Right. Just for the record, they're not owned by Monsanto.
No, they're in collaboration.
They're
it's a subsidiary.
Sort of partners or something. They're not. Yeah.
It's a subsidiary.
But some people now question the pushback as just because it's Monsanto, that doesn't mean that they're the cause of the problem. Yet the people on the right wing protecting sort of that establishment push on us leftists who say things like, if it's GMO, it's got to be the problem. So I think it's causing some polarization around this topic, and I'm not sure that we've really come together yet as a country to fully understand it.
Another thing that World Health Organization, CDC, Lancet, all these top medical researchers are saying that the guidelines, the fact that Brazil is saying that there's a spike in Zika cases, and spike in microcephaly, in small brain size in infants. They think it's partly to do with the lax criteria in the survey that was sent out. And they think there's massive over-reporting. We're seeing thousands. They haven't investigated all the cases yet, but there are thousands of cases that they have investigated, and it's come down to a handful of cases
to like 400. At first they said there was something like 3,000. And then what was interesting to me is the World Health Organization immediately declared it a health emergency of international consequence. Nature. And I thought, wow, before they've even really looked into it.
Because previous
Zika,
epidemics didn't cause birth defects in newborns, despite infecting 75% of the population in those countries.
Right.
Also, in other countries, such as Colombia, there are no records of microcephaly, but there's plenty of Zika cases. So right there is a big red flag.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so Robin was just saying that the World Health put out that it was a global threat.
A global threat.
I think as a virus, I think it's a global problem because it spreads so fast. I mean, it's they're seeing it exploding in South America now. It's coming up through Mexico.
It's in the United States now. They've got
already.
3 pregnant women in Florida tested positive for Zika. And they're also saying now that they believe Zika can be spread from person to person through sexual contact or exchange of bodily fluids, so that it's actually not just mosquito vector, it's human to human.
Right.
So if the Zika virus has mutated and become more dangerous, the fact that it's so easily passed with or without mosquitoes.
Well, there's one particular kind of mosquito that is the transmitter here, as they understand, and that's one that has learned to thrive in urban environments, from what I understand.
In houses.
It does well where there's high density of humans, and so if it were left in a sort of a natural ecosystem, it might not be this prominent of a problem, but it itself, the mosquito, has evolved to handle mutations well, and so there's this fight almost to stay ahead of evolution and the natural mutations that are happening, both in the virus, happening in the mosquitoes, such that I think in some way this is a predator on humans, and we've been approaching that war on those predators in the medical establishment as a war. And so we view it as a war. And maybe it's time to rethink the whole paradigm of medicine on how to not go virus by virus with an antidote that then forces
But there's so much money that way.
Yeah,
exactly. I know.
The billions of dollars.
Well, you're giving the evidence for why that whole path may be the wrong path.
Yeah.
Because just like with antibiotics, which are overprescribed, has created like super bacteria now.
Yeah.
So we're getting to super viruses through their mutation process, which is very natural, but they're trying to just survive as a species, which is innate to every species. And so given that, maybe we really need to pull back from all modern medicine approaches, all these vaccines, because, we're going to have an exponential growth of vaccines soon for all the flus, all the bacteria, all the viruses.
And in that vein, Bernie, when you're doing something where they genetically released these millions of genetically modified mosquitoes in that area, are now into the gene pool. When we start to interject there, we don't know where that's going. We're not thinking of the consequences.
Why did they genetically modify the mosquitoes?
To where they would become sterile if they mated.
They modified the male mosquitoes to make them sterile, so they would still mate with the female, and yet there would be no offspring. That's part of it. The other one that they are doing is they have modified their DNA so that they contain a bacterium that creates birth defects in mosquito larvae. So
And
the larvae never come to adult stage. They stay larvae and they die.
And the larvicide does that too. It's a growth inhibitor.
Right.
So
it's another one of these estrogen.
Yeah. So if you look at the growth,
inhibitors.
which alters the development process from larva to pupa in adults, or however you pronounce that. But how can that not be a factor?
Well, and what my understanding is, what they found, as has happened in other things like this, is that some of those mosquitoes were fertile. Some of the, nature always finds a way around any block, and so, you have some of those genetically modified mosquitoes actually were fertile and then so they're looking now to research what impact that could have had, or what's happened to the mosquitoes.
I found it interesting. I was reading about mosquitoes having evolved a technique. You know how when they fly by your face or your ear, they're there, and then you're out to kill them. Apparently, there's a mosquito that's evolved a technique to approach humans from the rear that does not go by our faces or our ears and goes undetected, into our ankles or our elbows or whatever they can find. So this evolutionary process is amazing, and we could outsmart ourselves here.
Well, it's interesting. There was a book that I read many years ago that I thought was great, and it's still so relevant. It's called The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance by Laurie Garrett. And she talks in this book, I think the book is like 20 years old, it's been out, and she talks about with what's happening, and Bernie, you talked about this earlier, with deforestation, with climate change, with global warming, is we're going to see a plethora of diseases emerging out of areas where they stayed, like maybe they were only, like with HIV, maybe they only stayed in chimpanzees, maybe they only stayed in certain populations, that they're going to start to cross over and encroach in territories that they normally would stay around the equator. Now they're going to be coming out into urban areas.
Well, one solution, if we really are afraid of a pandemic to wipe out our species or something like that, if we really had that fear, one easy step to take is stop airline travel, stop all of this migration of humans all over the world, and we would not be spreading these diseases. But we're not willing to do that. I guarantee
Donald Trump, he could build a wall.
But there's still going to be commerce coming across
But exactly,
borders.
corporations are never going to agree to a plan that stops global commerce.
No.
But I'm saying if we really, as a human species, were totally fearful, and we saw that our attempts at chemical warfare with these creatures wasn't working, we could just change our behavior. But are we really willing to change our behavior?
Yeah, and it is being spread by people. I mean, that's how it's being spread. People who are infected with it, which is almost everyone in tropical areas now. Traveling to other tropical areas, and now they'll be traveling from Brazil up to here. One hallmark of the Zika virus is that up to 80% of people who have it display no symptoms. So it's one of those things where it's a real toss of the dice whether you're actually going to have any ill effects from it to start with.
Yeah.
And of course, people with suppressed immune systems are the ones who are in danger. So, you're in danger from all kinds of terrible things if you go to the tropics and, the South come to that. I had an email from someone
I'm guessing from all the time I've spent in the Caribbean and in Mexico in the swamps of the Gulf Coast. I mean, my God, when I was a kid in the summer, you were just covered in mosquito bites. But they were going up and down the street spraying DDT at night, which I think I would have rather had Zika than breathe that DDT in.
There's one of the questions. What would be if it turns out that Zika is this or another virus that's borne by mosquitoes? are this terrible scourge and that they're life-threatening to our children or whatever, or our dogs, God forbid, then what measures would people be comfortable with? Would people be comfortable with having a vaccine? I know how some of you in this room feel about vaccines, but would you be comfortable with the mosquito vector district, as they wish to do, coming through our towns, spraying with, fogging at night, or coming into your house and fogging your house because that's where this mosquito likes to live?
Well, that approach hasn't worked. I mean, as you were saying, Robin, I too as a child remember these fogging machines coming through even the campground when you're out in nature trying to camp. They're driving down the roads doing that. And if these kind of warfare techniques that we as a species have employed on mosquitoes, what has it done is it's bred stronger mosquitoes. So we really should be thinking in completely different ways. And I think one of the simplest ways, and you talked about that on a previous show on pesticides, is that if we all take care not to have standing water, not to create breeding grounds for mosquitoes, that could be a very effective way of limiting their numbers. But the idea that we're going to wipe them out is ridiculous.
Eradication. Yeah, we always want to eradicate those troublemakers, don't we? Because we've done so well with so many mammals and birds, we can do it with insects too.
So it's interesting because Bernie and Paul, you both brought up the point, like, well, what are we willing to do and how far are we willing to go?
Yeah.
But pretty far, if people were recommended, women in Brazil were told don't get pregnant, and the Pope is saying that while this is ongoing, it is all right to use contraception.
Hooray for the Pope!
But what I'm saying is that
Zika.
is stunning. I mean, that's a stunning thing to tell a whole country, you better not get pregnant. And it's a stunning thing to have the Catholic Church, the Pope, say it's okay to use birth control. I mean, that's a huge cultural shift, and no one's even questioning that. And I find it slightly creepy in a way. You're going to tell, are you going to tell the whole planet? No, I mean, it could be very helpful, but, no one get pregnant. Everybody get on birth control.
We have an overpopulation problem on the planet, do we not? I mean, the planet can't really support the 7 billion that are here. People have estimated that we need to get down to about 1.5 billion in order to have the planet be able to keep up with sort of the human use of natural resources.
We're on our way with the use of the chemtrails and the vaccines and all of the pesticides that the kids are dealing with.
Yeah.
What Robin, you were saying that the teenage pregnancy rate has dropped dramatically since all of this was introduced.
Oh, one of the things that when I was doing research on the story I was doing on GMOs was Dr. Herbert Huber, who was on our Homeland Security against plant pathologies and bioterrorism against our agriculture and our livestock. And he had gone to Obama and to Vilsack at the Food and Drug Administration and agricultural, and had begged them not to release any more of the Roundup Ready alfalfa and things like that, because he and other veterinarians and people in the Midwest were seeing horrific rates of miscarriage, sterilization, infertility among livestock, and he felt it was related to glyphosate. And he said he started then checking around at hospitals and stuff in areas where people, in ag areas where people were exposed a lot to glyphosate, and they were saying, our miscarriage rates, infertility rates are all up. And I remember him saying, people are going to, right now people worry too much about, oh my God, if my daughter gets pregnant. He said fertility rates are going to be dramatically dropping. You'll see the teen pregnancy rate drop, and it won't be because of abstinence got sold through to everybody. So so it's very interesting. We are seeing that, and I mean I think just if you think about, for my generation. You didn't know that many people that had to have fertility treatment or were infertile. And I would say of all the young children I know in my life, of a lot of my friends, probably 30 to 40% of them had to undergo some kind of fertility treatment in order to have a child.
Wow.
I mean, that's a big shift.
Huge.
It is. I mean, again, it becomes this intervention by medical establishment rather than being able sort of to do it more naturally because all these chemicals have been introduced into our environment.
Yeah, it's big business and big money.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, fertility clinics are huge business. It's a huge business. So, and once again, the people with money can make things happen for themselves that they want or need to have happen, but who gets impacted health-wise and family choice-wise are the poor. I mean, global warming and climate change is a justice issue because who's getting hurt? These people in Brazil are not wealthy 1%ers. They're living in this horrible squalor.
Paraíba, in the poorest part of urban style Brazil, yeah. So as global warming happens, this is going to spread north. Certainly this mosquito is going to spread north. So, I guess that's the question I would like to hear from other people. What would they be willing to put up with if this, just in combating mosquitoes, which is it's a very topical point right now because our Marin Sonoma Mosquito and Vector Control District has just the West Marin agreement with them expired at the end of last year, and they are kicking against trying to renew it or to have any kind of agreement with West Marin not to have them come out and put chemicals in our septics and which get into the environment or fogging or whatever they want to do. So right now we're in a little fight with the powers that be to try and stop them poisoning our environment for the sake of trying to eradicate mosquitoes.
Well, an ancillary point to that, Paul, I wonder, why are we so powerless about the chemtrails, which is part of the story? No one knows who and why except it's private people. Why is that happening when there's so much resistance and awareness now?
Well, I think because it's too hard to figure out who's there, but...
Yeah.
So, Paul, you were talking about the mosquito control vector issues and what are we willing to do? So, to think about it honestly, let's say we do know that mosquitoes are coming to our area and they do carry some really nasty diseases. But as Bernie brought up, I'd like to see more proof. Does spraying help as much as doing things like putting the mosquito fish in your pond and all of those things?
Well, that was part of the agreement, was that the guys in the field for the district would come out and do stuff like that and inspect septic tank vents, make sure they're all screened and all that.
So I think that was, you said 10 years ago, that the citizens of West Marin really stood up, became activists, pushed back and said, let us deal with it. Keep your spray out of here. We will take care of it. Yeah. So where are those people now?
Yeah.
Because I feel like activists sometimes rise up at the right moment, and here's a time where maybe it's time we have to stand up again, because if we don't, then we're all going to be dealing with that poison being sprayed.
Well, so part of what happened it was pretty much 10 years ago, was that there was so much feeling about it, so much pushback against the district coming in and applying whatever they wanted to apply. There was actually a West Marin Mosquito Council was formed here. I'm on it right now. Other people have been on it for a long time, for almost 10 years. And there was also a committee as part of the district that was solely to be in liaison with West Marin to keep that going. But for the past year or so, there have been people in charge of that committee who are not as tolerant of West Marin's adversity to their pesticides, and so they were trying whatever they could to push through the doing away with the agreement and not having a new agreement. The woman who's in charge of the committee actually said, we don't want an agreement with West Marin.
I'm suggesting that it's not just West Marin that pushed back, but everybody that's within this vector district. In other words, because the bureaucracy finds it easier to hire a contractor and say, spray this thing, than it does to deal with the cumbersomeness of committees and local people and education to have us all participate in it. So I think they're driven sort of economically to want a simple solution for all.
Of course.
And we're saying, no, we don't want your simple bureaucratic solution. And I think that people throughout the North Bay that are part of this vector district ought to wake up.
Well, that was remarkable at the time, was that we were the only the only part of the district that were actually pushing against the spraying and the fogging.
Is that resistance still in place?
The committee is still in place, and right now we're in conversation. Steve Kinsey's helping out because we needed some bigger guns because it was obvious that the district was favoring not allowing us to choose what we wanted to spray. The other, there is one recourse that we can do is to take ourselves out of the district. But then you wouldn't have any kind of control. The guys in the field have been great. They've been coming out and advising people and telling them, get rid of this standing water, get rid of those tires, and they check the sewer vents and they check
septic systems.
They would want to make sure that the septic tank wasn't leaking. I mean, that's usually where the mosquito problem is, apart from over in Inverness where there's a lot of standing water just in the forest. There's enough moisture for them to reproduce out there. So they've been advising on that, but there hasn't been. We found out the end of last year that there was no liaison between the district and the utility districts, like Stinson-Bolinas Utility District. They're in charge of septic tank maintenance. It's their job to, if they hear that there's a leak, they go out and fix it. And the district was not telling the utility district. The mosquito district wasn't in touch with the utility district. So instead of telling the utility district there was a problem with a septic tank, the mosquito district would come out 2-3 times, and that's what the whole thing they're saying, it's costing so much to come out to West Marin. That's because there was no discussion between districts.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I see activism here in West Marin on all sorts of issues. You mentioned chemtrails, and I know a lot of people are concerned about that. I know nuclear, a lot of people are concerned about. When we had the smart meters that PG&E was bringing into our homes and bringing that EMF closer to us, people were willing to stand in the street in front of a truck to keep it from happening. Well, have we run out? Like, nobody's called today. I'm a little annoyed. Come on, listeners. If you care about this issue not getting controlled by the establishment and the average person, hey,
there we go.
Thank you. I hope I didn't shame you into this, but I want to see a little more activism.
That's the other line.
Are you there?
Yes.
Hi. What's your name?
My name's Mac. I'm in Marin County.
Hey, Mac.
Hi, Mac.
Welcome.
Welcome to the show. What do you think?
Thanks a lot for the topic and the panel today.
Thank you. So what are your thoughts on this?
Malaria was eradicated in the United States in 1951.
Uh-huh.
How was that done? And can it be applied to the current situation with Zika?
That's a good question.
And wasn't that done? A lot of that involves spraying, I believe. Are you familiar with it, Mac?
No, I'm not. I just
Yeah.
have to remember that date. And also, another question is, what if somebody's tested positive for Zika, and happens to be a man, and that individual would become a carrier?
That's right.
What do we do with those individuals?
That's right. Well, so, like I said, almost everyone in these tropical areas now is a carrier, whether they're showing symptoms or not. And they found that the blood, checking for Zika in the blood is not working as well as checking for it in semen and saliva and other bodily fluids for some reason. Nobody knows why. It shows up in placental fluid. It shows up in, all the other fluids, but the blood is not a great way to do it. What do we do with them? I don't know. If it becomes widespread enough, everyone would be a carrier, I suppose. I don't know. What would we do with it? It's like the flu virus, everyone has a little bit of flu in them. We'd all be carriers. What would you suggest, Mac?
Gee whiz. What about, is it possible to build a activist political bubble surrounding West Marin? You're exempt from the laws of nature and the winds carrying the mosquito from my backyard to your backyard.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll build a wall, and the rest of Marin will pay for it.
All right. Well, I'll leave you with that thought.
So, Mac, I just looked up on malaria. The National Malaria Eradication Program was a cooperative undertaking by state and local agencies of 13 southeastern states. And the program commenced operations in 1947, and it consisted primarily of DDT application to the interior surfaces of rural homes or entire premises in counties where malaria is reported to have been prevalent. And by the end of 1949, more than 5 million house spray applications had been made.
Well,
that suggests a wall of DDT. I mean, did mosquitoes stop entering the United States because they'd heard that DDT had been sprayed? Okay, I'll stop being silly. I'll leave the four of you to solve all this.
Well,
Thank
I
you
think
very much,
we'll have
Mac.
Donald Trump build a DDT wall.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank
Mac.
you.
Well, I think what I would suggest we don't do that we've been doing is continue to find sort of a global solution of here's a vaccine that if every person takes it, because before long there'll be right now there's 23 for an infant 2 years old. Pretty soon there'll be 100 by the time you're 6 or whatever. This is an exponential problem, and if we always solve it the same way, we're going to lose that battle long run anyway.
Yeah, and it's a very toxic solution.
And what it does is it keeps our children really from developing immunities the natural way. It used to be that, yes, you would suffer with some symptoms from a particular bacteria or influenza or whatever, but in that process, you were naturally, as a child, building up an immunity such that as an adult, you were more resilient than if you had been always vaccinated. And I'm really afraid that by taking the technology into an establishment, government-controlled, mandated program like we have right now for school children, that we're trying to master nature from the standpoint of science and drugs and chemicals and solutions like that. And we've really lost that will to want to say, okay, we're just going to have to sort of wait it out as a population.
Well, in defense of humanity, I think it isn't a question of losing will. There have been very serious propaganda programs in place to bring us to this state of mind. This is not the natural response. This is a very programmed response.
A capitalist response.
Well, I don't know what you want to call it. I would call it more of a greedy response because they know they can make a lot of money. If you keep people afraid, you can manipulate them very easily. And I don't think that can be ignored.
Yeah. No, I call it a capitalist in the sense that it's an opportunity for people to own a patent on a particular chemical, and that gives them profit, and it's our private property rights that underpin this whole profitability system that the greed, which is, you can say, is natural in humans, gets extended in a negative way to our society.
Well, I want to just share a little bit of an anecdote. I was at a oil convention, and during the lunch, I sat next to an emergency room nurse. And her story, I said, well, my gosh, now you're working for a naturopath. How did this happen? She said, well, it started with when the kids came in to get vaccinated, the nurses would all talk about when they thought the kids were going to come back with these respiratory problems, etc. That was presented to the doctors and not paid any attention to. But the real kicker was I was at a conference and I was sitting next to the director of the hospital's desk. There was a memo on the desk, and I couldn't help but look at it, from a very well-known laboratory of micropharmaceutical drugs. I don't know if I'm allowed to say who it was.
Sure.
Merck. And they shared that they had come up with a vaccine that caused a certain reaction in people. And now we're to find a disease that matches the vaccine. Pretty horrifying. And she said that was it.
Merck is the number one vaccine manufacturer.
Yeah,
I'm told.
that was, she said, I handed in my resignation the next day.
Cool.
So this is interesting. When I did an article about a year ago and spent a couple of weeks working with what are called treatment-free beekeepers, or the James Bond method called live and let die of beekeeping. And what they're saying is what's happening to the bees by us trying to find all these ways to like kill the mice and do this and treat them and treatment, that bees, because the beauty and genius of bees is how quickly they can change the genetic structure. If a hive starts to get unhealthy, they'll kill the queen and raise a new queen right away, and then let her be released, because then she goes and picks up DNA from, maybe 20, 30 other drone bees that are out there, brings that back to the hive, and starts to lay new eggs. So it's a whole new. And if they're still not healthy, they'll keep killing the queen and sending out for new DNA.
Wow.
And so what happens is, if we're bringing in these treated bees and things and having them mixed in with our treatment-free bees, then they have weak genetics that are shored up by drugs. And that's the way I look at it is, I had mumps, I had measles, I had rubella, I had, so for my whole life, I am immune to that. The kids getting the vaccines that never had the diseases, those vaccines tend to wear off, and they don't know how quick to do them. So I'm just thinking, once again, if we're messing with things, as Bernie was saying, through technology, overall, we're weakening our species.
I have dozens of articles on my computer here, but here's one talking about microcephaly. I've seen figures where you expect in a population 1 in 10,000 or 2 in 10,000 babies to be born with microcephaly. It's known to be linked to some parasitic and bacterial diseases, as well as rubella, herpes, HIV, exposure to chemicals such as arsenic, mercury, and alcohol, and radiation. So there are many causes for this. Who knows what combination of things came
for this spike to happen?
Came to a head there in the poorer parts of Brazil, so my concern is that they jump on this mosquito-borne virus, which is a horrible virus. It does nasty things to you, and it can probably kill you if you're really immune suppressed. But the way that it all suddenly happened, that our media was reporting that this is the link and it's causing microcephaly, it may turn out to be that it is the case, but that would be a remarkable change in a virus's behavior that for 70 years has never caused anything like that to suddenly do that. So,
Robin, earlier you were talking about the Pope, and in Brazil, I'm understanding it's illegal to have an abortion, and unfortunately, I think women are still having them, but having them in really horrific ways, where they're just abandoning the fetuses or the children with the problem. And maybe this is an opportunity for a global conversation with the Pope to start changing some of the attitudes that we've had that are
the very
not helpful.
fact that the Pope said that he thought it was absolutely that God would approve of women using contraception when something like this was happening, and
that's a big step.
Wait and see. That's
a huge shift.
Huge for the Pope to say that. But it's also very interesting because you just think about how, that they came up with this so quickly, because there was a report that I had read, and I think I posted it on our Let's Talk Facebook page, that they were talking about how they developed the link between rubella and deafness, as rubella and birth defects caused by rubella. And it took something like 8 years of a huge team of scientists to actually find a causation, and that was back before we were nuking ourselves with EMFs and chemicals and vaccines and all the stuff that is the hodgepodge we're dealing with now. So to jump to this conclusion this fast seemed very, very fear-mongering to me.
Well, I think what happened was they were with babies that were either aborted or died from microcephaly. They found the virus in the brain tissue. And
that's not where it usually is?
I don't know that, but that's what caused them to think it was Zika that did it. So it's crossing the blood-brain barrier.
Well, when
they don't know what the mechanics of that are.
When you have a weakened immune system and you're living under terrific conditions of poverty and you're nutritionally deficient, it can go anywhere.
Well, that is an interesting point, because my understanding is that it's very rare for something to cross the blood-brain barrier that way, especially in an infant, in utero.
And that's part of the thing they're investigating now. They don't know how it's doing that, really.
So
because it's a you can see it, the virus in electron microscope. It's a big old thing that should not be able to cross that barrier. But yeah.
So
something else is happening there.
Yeah, I mean, and
There's
like I said, you
something-
had the larvicide increase, then you have genetically modified mosquitoes, and I mean you had so many things happening within that time, and the women getting those vaccinations.
And the spike in microcephaly in Brazil actually started in 2012, which was
That's when they put the larvicide
was
in.
when they were using the old larvicide that stopped working, and it spiked in 2014. It's actually decreasing now.
So
That's because they've stopped using the larvicide.
Who knows?
No, that's happened. But Brazil just
Well, they
mentioned
just
it.
stopped it,
They
yeah, but-
just stopped it,
but they're
and
saying
they're not
it's been-
admitting to
it's
anything.
been decreasing
but they're
all year, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah. No, they can't admit they're wrong, of course.
is there a pandemics industry kind of springing up, and
Right.
media feeds into any of these stories because they're salacious in a way?
Yeah.
And
Sure.
If it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah.
We
It's
learned that in news.
horrific
and they get
photographs
tired of
babies, right?
reporting on the presidential contest that has been occupying the news, and Russia hasn't done anything lately, and ISIS has been quiet.
Oh wait,
so this is a
North
big deal.
Korea. North Korea. We have to be worried about North Korea.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Frankly, that's what I'm afraid of.
So we're always afraid of all of these things, but what we're not seemingly paying attention to is what is underlying all of that. In other words, we're really not questioning the way we live as a culture, as a civilization that has sort of centralized the responses to everything and created this complex medical establishment and ultimately pharmaceutical establishment and healthcare establishment. We've lost touch with a more natural way of coexisting. In
Follow
nature.
the money.
Well,
This has been. You follow the money, and you
It's
see.
always about
Yeah.
money. I mean, what money is the root of all evil? I mean, it's basically that because as a global economy and as pretty much a global culture, we believe in profit and people making profit off of things, and
Yeah.
that is not sustainable.
And luckily, there are indigenous cultures still alive. We haven't totally usurped them all or wiped them all out, who show us that it's possible to live for thousands of years in a way that is perfectly in balance with nature.
Exactly. It's so
And,
ironic, isn't it? that-
Hopefully, we will
Perfect.
discover, because more and more we're discovering, like in North America, the indigenous folks that Christopher Columbus and the Jamestown people and the Pilgrims all ran into, they completely didn't value their values.
Yeah.
They learned a little bit from them, like the Iroquois to the Constitution,
Yeah.
but not enough.
Yeah.
And
They
we
kept
were
out the
really,
women.
We were awfully arrogant as Europeans, and we're still pretty damn arrogant as a civilization.
But we were trained to colonize and to take over and to grab stuff, get stuff,
Yeah.
get your ships over there and
In
take
the
stuff.
name of the king of Spain or some big authority figure who was the original capitalist, and now these capitalists aren't kings anymore, but they're corporate CEOs, if you will, who are in that same position of calling the shots.
So basically, this fear mongering, which is, as Mary brought up earlier, the whole Ebola scare was like, oh my God, Ebola could spread all throughout the United States.
Yeah, we're all
And
gonna die of
We're all going
Ebola.
to die of Ebola. Now we've got this Zika scare. And there's also, and this may not be a very popular point of view, but sometimes I think about like something happens, 9/11, several thousand people died. Several thousand people die every month in the United States. I don't mean to sound callous or crass, but there's this way in which we're not using our brains and not going, but what we wouldn't killed, 500,000 people, or we wouldn't that even looking at disease the same way. So if this disease happens but it only affects 3 to 4% of pregnancies, if somebody gets Zika, if they can figure that out, why aren't we allowing humans and human nature to have a certain percent of us are going to die from diseases, or we're going to fall out of the tree and, break our leg, or that we're making ourselves so unhealthy in this thing that you cannot have a single death.
Everything to be safe, right? I mean, the helmets and knee pads and don't climb that tree. I don't know. You want everyone to be safe. Where do you draw the line, though, once you start doing things
Well,
like that?
I think part of our problem with our human hubris is that we haven't had predators on us. We're the apex species here, but we've learned
Viruses.
Well, exactly. But unless you're kept in check, almost every species overpopulates until it runs into having overeaten its food supply, and then it dies back. Well, we're the same way. I mean, we have overeaten the fossil fuel supply and the trees and the fish and the soil nutrients. We've taken all of that, and now it's time to die back a little. So the idea of going from 7 billion down a couple billion over time is really a good idea, I think, for the longevity of our species. We have to honor that mutations are a part of evolution, and that's what we're experiencing here. But by interfering, we actually haven't solved the problem. We've made it worse. We create these super bugs, like the super antibiotics that are necessary now.
Anyway, I want to thank all our listeners, all of you out there, and our caller today for their participation. I hope you tune in every Thursday at 11, because your voice really does matter.